Hey, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and in this video, we're going to create this Toast notification system using SvelteKit and Tailwind CSS. Before we get started, I want to mention that this is coming from a free code challenge on skillthrive.com. You can go ahead and sign up if you want to download the Figma file, and you can also view all the solutions for this specific challenge as well as all of our other premium and free code challenges on Skillthrive. But of course, if you don't want to sign up, I'll be sure to include a link to the GitHub in the description below so you can check out the final code that we create in this project. The next thing is what you need to know. First, you need to know HTML basics. You also need to know CSS basics. Even though we're using Tailwind CSS for this project, I always think it's a good idea before you start using Tailwind CSS to actually understand how CSS works. That way you have a better understanding of what it's doing, as well as a greater appreciation for what Tailwind CSS is doing behind the scenes. Also, it would be a good idea if you're familiar with how Svelte works. Of course, I'll be covering some topics in this because we're using SvelteKit, but it's also just a good idea to kind of be familiar with how it works. Check out the link in the description to the Svelte Docs, which will walk you through a quick interactive tutorial if you want to get familiar with some of the concepts. Next, let's talk about what you need to install. I'll be using VS Code as my code editor, and you're free to use whatever you want, but we will be using some extensions, and I can't guarantee that whatever code editor you're using will have those extensions ready for you. The next thing you need to install is Node. This is going to be what we use to set up our project, to run our dev server, and install certain packages. Now, if you don't have Node set up on your computer, I'll be sure to link a documentation in the description so you can follow that and set it up. And the last thing, and this is optional, is to have Prettier code set up on VS Code. This is just going to format all of our code, and we'll be using a Tailwind CSS Prettier plugin in this tutorial to format our Tailwind CSS and keep our styles organized. Again, if you want to set this up on your computer, I'll be sure to list some documentation in the description below. All right, so let's jump in and get started on our project. The first thing I'm going to do is open up my terminal and head to where I want to go ahead and create this project. In my case, it's going to be on my desktop in a folder called Solutions. Then I'm going to follow the Tailwind CSS docs on how to set up Tailwind CSS with SvelteKit. I'm going to copy this part right here, come back and then paste it in. And then I'm going to follow this with the name of the folder for this project. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit enter or return. I'm going to get prompted with a couple questions here, and I'm going to select a skeleton project. I won't be using TypeScript in this tutorial, so I'm going to say no. And then this is a new prompt, but in order to select these values, you want to hit spacebar. Now I'm just going to select add Prettier, and once I have that selected, I can hit enter or return, and then it will go ahead and create the project for me. As you can see, the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and head into my folder here, and that is Tailwind tutorial. Then run npm install. You can see here it actually gives us a little commit message if we want to use Git, which I suggest you do. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And the next thing I want to do, because I'm in the folder and using VS Code, I can type out code and then period, and then this will open up our project in VS Code. Once VS Code opens, I'm going to exit out this welcome menu and then go ahead and open up our terminal. From here, I'm going to go ahead and follow the rest of the Tailwind CSS documentation. The first thing we need to do is install all the dependencies. So I'll copy and paste this code and let it go ahead and install that. Then we need to go ahead and create our Tailwind config file. So I'll run this command. Then we need to add the following code in our Svelte config file. So I'll click here to copy all this code, come into my Svelte config file, and go ahead and replace all that code here. Then we need to go ahead and come into our Tailwind config file and copy this code. And what this is doing is essentially telling Tailwind CSS where it needs to look for changes. That way, once we change and add styles, Tailwind will know where it needs to update the styles so we actually see those updated in our development server. So let's go ahead and copy this, come into this Tailwind config file that we just created, and replace that code here. The next thing we need to do is we need to create an app.css file in our source folder and import all of our utilities from Tailwind. So I'll come into the source folder, create a new file called app.css, and then paste these values here. The next thing we need to do is create a layout Svelte component. And this is going to be a root layout Svelte component, meaning that it's going to be applied to all of the pages on our site, which is a good place to apply the CSS. Right now, we don't have a layout.svelte file created, so we need to come into the routes and create one here. Then I just go ahead and copy this code and paste it here. Now you might be curious what this slot component does. Well, what this means is that anything that is rendered inside of this layout is just going to be rendered here in this slot component. So if you're coming from something like React, think of this like children. Anything that this is wrapped in is going to be rendered here. And because this is a root layout, that essentially means anything inside of our routes is going to have this layout component applied to it, which again is a good place to import our CSS because we want our styles applied throughout our entire project. So let's go back into our documentation. You can see now it's just telling us to run our server. So npm run dev. Then I'm gonna head into the page.svelte file, remove this, come back and just copy this example here. So now we should see the text 3XL styles applied. The font should be bold and it should be underlined in our dev server. So let's go ahead and open that up. You can see right here, that's exactly what's applied. So right now we have Tailwind CSS essentially set up, but we do have some configurations that we need to set up, which we'll do in the next part. Before we finish adding all the Tailwind CSS configuration, I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of different plugins as well as some dev dependencies that's going to make our life easier working with Tailwind as well as Svelte. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and stop the server here. And I'm going to go ahead and install the Tailwind Prettier plugin, which if you're using Prettier to format your code, it's an opinionated way that's going to organize your classes for you. That way you can just write them and the plugin is going to take care of organizing those and keeping them organized throughout your code base. If you don't have Prettier set up on VS Code, I'll be sure to link some documentation in the description below for you to follow. The next thing I need to do is copy and paste this command, which is going to install Prettier and the Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS as a dev dependency. And we know it's installing it as a dev dependency because it has this capital D flag following the npm install. Once that's done, if we come down and select the package.json file and come down to dev dependencies, we'll see that we now have the Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS. Now, anytime we save our files, the classes will be organized for us automatically, so we don't have to worry about the order of how they're actually being applied. If you want to learn more about how these are organized, I'll be sure to include a link in the description below so you can check that out in more detail. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about some of the VS Code extensions I'm using in this project. So I'm going to come over here to this extensions tab, and the first one I'm using is the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So we look up Tailwind CSS, you'll see here the official one from Tailwind Labs is this Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. And essentially, this is going to give us things like autocomplete as well as the ability to hover over certain classes and then seeing the actual CSS that's being applied. And this just makes it easier working with Tailwind CSS in general. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to look for the VS Code for Svelte plugin. Again, we're looking for the one with the little verified or is from the actual svelte.dev. So this is the official Svelte for VS Code extension. And this gives us things like syntax highlighting and formatting as well as IntelliSense in our VS Code environment. That way, again, just makes it a lot easier working with Svelte files in our project. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing I'm going to do is come back into my Tailwind config file. And I want to add some values here under this theme value. And what I want to add are some colors as well as defining the font family. Now, if you come into the actual code base here, or excuse me, not the code base, but the Figma file, you'll see that we're using General Sans, which is a free open source font. Again, this is included in the font files, but I'll show you where you can actually get this online as well. And the only font weights we need are regular and semi-bold. So what we need to do is we first need to download these files. Again, I include these files for you already in the course downloads, but let's just go ahead and talk about what it looks like downloading these ourselves. So the first thing here is I go to fontshare.com and I go to the General Sans. Then once I'm actually on this page, I can click here to download the entire font family. Save that somewhere on my computer. And then I want to go ahead and open this. Now, if you're installing this for the first time, you actually want to come into Fonts and then OTF, and then select all of these and install them on your computer. That way, if you use Figma, you can open these up and install these on your machine so they're accessible in Figma and other programs. What we want to do is we want to come into Web, come into Fonts, and then select the fonts that we need. Now you can see here that there is a bunch of different fonts. We have the WAF and WAF2 files. Essentially all we need are the WAF and WAF2, and we need those for the regular and the semi-bold fonts. Now where are we going to actually put these? Well, we put these in a folder called static in our actual project, which is where you can put static files like certain images, as well as this is a good place for fonts. And to do this, what I'm going to do is create a new folder, and it's going to be called fonts. Then I'm going to head back into this code here and then select the files that I want to add to this. The first ones here are the regular WAF and WAF2. So I'm just going to select these and drop these here. And I also need to get the semi-bold WAF and WAF2 files. Again, I'll drop these here. Now there's actually some more that we could do here, like subsetting fonts and optimizing these font files a little bit more. And if you want to learn more about how to do that, we actually, I just published a new article on how to optimize web fonts and use them in your web projects. So check out the link in the description below if you want a deeper dive on how we can actually use fonts in our projects. But this is a good way just to get started. And it's still, for the most part, it's very optimized because we're using the WAF and WAF2 formats. Now that we imported the fonts, we need to go ahead and tell our CSS about them. And we do that in this folder that we created, the app.css file. And the way we define the fonts is with the @fontface directive. So we say @fontface. Then we define the font family. And the font family is just whatever name you want to reference this font as. In this case, we're going to call it General Sans. Then we specify the source, which is where this file is within our actual project. And we do that with a URL, and that's going to be in the fonts file. It's going to be then the name of the font. So General Sans, regular, and then the WAF2. Now, whatever you list first is what you're telling the CSS to load first. So this is the first file we want to load. And if the browser doesn't support this file, we can then supply some fallback files. Now, at the time of recording this video, I think the actual support for WAF2 and WAF files are somewhere of upwards of like 98% of browsers actually support them. So you shouldn't have any issues unless for some reason you know you're supporting older browsers. But in this case, this should be fine. And it looks like I actually made a mistake here. It shouldn't be a comma, but a semicolon. So after we do the URL, the next thing we need to do is tell it the format. In this case, it is a WAF2 format. Now let's go ahead and define our fallback file. And I'm just going to actually copy this source and paste it below. And then end this with a semicolon. Now here, instead of doing the WAF2, we'll just do the WAF file and then change this to the regular WAF. Okay, then we say the font weight. So this is the, because this is a regular font, the font weight is 400. The font style is just normal because there's no italicizing or anything like that. And we also want to set this font display. For font display, we have a couple of different options, and I go into more details on this article that I mentioned earlier, the Ultimate Guide to Web Fonts that we published a couple weeks ago. And essentially this controls the block period and the swap period. And there's different options that you can use, and I go into a little bit more details on what, would be the best option depending on what you want. Now, for example, what we're going to be using is this optional one. And this option is if your web font usage is is a second priority to having a fast load time. So essentially what optional does is that if the font doesn't load in a certain time period, it's just going to use the fallback fonts. And this is good because you don't want to do something like this one right here, like block, because what would happen is the text is actually invisible until the font loads, and that could be a bad user experience. Another one you see often used is swap, but like I said, in this case, we're just going to be using optional. Again, if you want to learn more about, web fonts and how to optimize them in your projects, be sure to check out the link in the description. So let's go back into our code here and change this to optional. All right, so now that we have the regular font defined, we need to do essentially the same thing, but do it for the semi-bold. So I'm just going to copy this, and then paste it below. Then we're just going to change the actual file names. So this is going to be semi-bold. The font weight is going to be 600, and the rest of it is unchanged. So now our CSS knows once we reference this font name, this font family name, where we should actually be getting the font. And just because we define these here doesn't mean the fonts are actually loading when our project is accessed. Instead, our fonts are only going to be used or loaded when they're actually used in our CSS, which is an important thing to note. So now that we have that, we need to tell Tailwind CSS that we want to use these fonts. Again, we do that in our Tailwind config file. The first thing I want to do is I want to import something from Tailwind CSS. And that something, I'm not sure why that happened, and that something is called font family. And this is going to give us access to all the default font families for our different font family styles. So in this case, we can get all the sans fallback fonts, and then instead of just writing them ourselves, Tailwind CSS gives us this option and we can just access them there. So we're requiring this from Tailwind CSS default theme. All right, so now that we have that imported, we can use it below right here under this extend. This is where we're going to be adding all of our different styles and theme options. The first one is going to be font family. Then for the sans font, we're going to pass in an array. In this array, we're going to say, hey, the first thing we want to do for the sans font, which is worth mentioning, the sans font is the default for Tailwind CSS. We want to go ahead and use the general sans. Now keep in mind, this name needs to match the same name that we defined here in this font family. Otherwise, it won't work. Then what we want to do is go ahead and spread out all of our fallback fonts. And again, we can get access to that from font family. And then there's this sans object that we can go ahead and get access to. All right, so now that we have that, we should be able to see this font loading in our project. So let's come back into our server. Or actually, we need to make sure our server is running first. So we'll come back and run npm run dev. And once that's loaded, let's come back here. And it looks like we're getting an error. So we did something wrong. And it looks like I have a typo here. All right, so once I restart the server, I can now see if I come into this inspect, come into our network, and refresh this page, we should see the font loading in, which we can see right here. We get a 200, and the font is properly loading from our fonts file. And again, this is the only one. The regular font is the only one that's loading in because it's the only one used on the page. So the next thing we need to do is go ahead and define the color values that we want to reference in Tailwind CSS. Now, Tailwind CSS comes with some default values, and some of these names that we're using today are already values that are supported. So what we need to do is we're just going to reference these color names and then change the color values. So the first thing you might be wondering is, where are we getting these color values? And we're getting them from our Figma file. So again, if we come in and come into color styles, I have all of these listed here, and you can also see them here on the right panel. If you don't have anything selected, you'll see all of the local styles. And if you zoom in here, I made it a little handy, I made it a lot easier for you to copy and paste these values over. Now, this kind of is a tedious process, and it's really no different if you were just using, vanilla CSS and we're using something like CSS variables. So essentially all I did is I go back from this file to the CSS and copy and paste the hex codes for all the values. So to save some time, I'm just going to copy and paste the values that I already had in my finished project, and then I'll just talk briefly about how this works, and then we can go ahead and move on to the rest of the project. So with that said, I'm going to come back to the code, and under where we define the font family, I'm going to go ahead and define the color styles. So you can see here, the first thing we do is we define this value called colors, which is an object, and then we can pass whatever value names that we want to reference for our colors. The first one is neutral, which is going to be referenced from this 50 value. So for example, if we wanted to set a background color, it would be bg-neutral-50, and that style would then apply this hex code. So then I just go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of the colors. And you will notice if we come all the way down here, we have this color called white and black. So the difference here is that because this is only one color, and for example, I could reference this like for the background as bg-white, I don't need to put this in an object because it's just one value. So again, this is a little tedious, which is why I didn't do this all by hand, but hopefully it makes a lot of sense on how you can actually set up your actual color styles in the Tailwind CSS files. Now you might be wondering, well, how do you know this? Like, how do you know where to actually go? And what we do is just go into the Tailwind config documentations. So we come into the docs and search for something like colors or whatever we want to actually look into. And if we come into this documentation and look over here on this right, you'll see that there's all these different things that we can do. So we can have these custom values on aliasing colors. So for example, we can use gray and actually be referring to the slate color. We could also add our own colors, which is what we just did. And we could also, do things like disabling a default color. So always refer to the documentation for Tailwind CSS, and it's really, really great documentation. If anything you want to update, like padding or margin or line height, anything like that, the documentation is where you want to go to reference what you need to do in your config file. So now that we've actually created that, we should be able to reference this inside of our code. So let's come back into our project here, into our page.svelte. You can see here that right now we're not using any color here. So let's use the brand color. So we'll do text, brand, and you can see the IntelliSense already has all of these styles that we set up for us. And let's go ahead and select this purple color and then save it. Now if we come into our project, you'll see that that purple color is being applied. All right, so we're going to be coming back to this Tailwind config file eventually to add a custom animation, but we'll get to that later in the tutorial. For now, we can go ahead and start moving on and working on the Svelte part of this tutorial. And the first thing we want to do is go ahead and create a store. Now, if you're coming from something like React, like I did, you would typically reach for something like a library to manage your store. And by all means, you can still use a library with Svelte, but it also has a built-in way to create and manage store. And it's really intuitive and very simple to use. And you can do things like subscribing to the store and listening to changes and handling all that very simply, which we'll cover in this tutorial. The first thing we want to do in creating our store is come into the source folder and create a new one called lib, which stands for library. This is where all of our components and our store values are going to be stored. So we'll create a new folder, and inside here, we'll create one called store. And last, inside of this folder, we'll create a new file called toast.js. Before we get started writing this code for creating this store, which is going to hold all of the state for our toast, let's talk about why we even need store to begin with. And the reason is because we're going to be referencing this store value or the state of this toast throughout our application. So somewhere in the application, maybe further down the road, we need to throw a toast notification where an error happens. And we also need to do one somewhere once someone signs up for our app or anything like that. And the challenge is if we could be passing props and values throughout our application and prop drilling, but a better way is to just store this somewhere in a store like this that we can reference anywhere in our application. All right, so now that it's clear why you would want to use a store in the first place, we're going to go ahead and install one package that we're going to be using here to generate unique IDs. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our terminal here, stop the terminal, and install a package called UUID. All right, so now that we have that, we can close the terminal and go ahead and start writing our store. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to import writable from the Svelte store. Then below this, we want to import the v4 as UUID v4. Now you could import this as wherever you want, but this is how we're going to be referencing the function for creating the unique IDs. And that's coming from this file that we just imported, the UUID. All right, so now that we have that, I want to go ahead and export the state. And we're going to call this state toast. Now in this case, we're creating a writable state, which means that we can read as well as write to this state, meaning that we can update the values inside of it. Sometimes you might not want the user to be able to update the state. You only want it to read the state. But in this case, we need the option to do both. Now this state, the initial value, is just an empty array. Inside this array is where we're going to be putting all of our toast notifications that we will read off of later in the tutorial. All right, so now that we have that, let's export a const called add toast, which is going to be a function for, you guessed it, adding a toast to our toast state. Now this is going to take in a couple of values. The first one is title, the second one is message, and the third is type. Now this type 1 is going to be used for actually handling what colors as well as what icons should render in the toast notification. Now inside of this function, it looks like I misspelled this. So inside of this function, I'm going to create an ID, which is going to call that function. Now I want to go ahead and update the state. And there's this handy function that Svelte provides for us called update. And we can get a value from this, which is the current state. Now you could name this state or whatever you want, but what I like to do is call it something like current toast, which is a little bit more descriptive of what it is. And we're going to return an array that's going to be the updated state. Now the first thing we want to do is get access to all of our current toast. And then we want to go ahead and add a new object or a new toast item inside of this state. It's going to have an ID. It's going to have a title, a message, and a type. Now remember, these are coming from from where we pass them in inside of this function once we actually call it. Now the next thing we want to do is when we add this value to our state, after 5 seconds, we want to remove it from the state. And we can do that with the set timeout function, which is, standard JavaScript. It comes right out of the box with JavaScript, and it's very simple to do. First, we say set timeout. Then we say the name of the function that we want to call, in this case, remove toast, which we haven't written yet. But what this is going to do is take in an ID. This ID is going to be used to look through the actual state, find the matching ID, and then remove it from the state, and therefore removing it from the DOM. And the next thing we need to do is say how long before this function actually runs, which is going to be in milliseconds. So in milliseconds, that's going to be 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. All right, so that's our add toast function. Now we just have one more function to write, and that is our remove toast function. So again, we'll say export const remove toast. Again, this takes in an ID. Again, we call toast.update, passing in our current state, which we'll call current toast. And again, we're going to return an array from here. Now we're going to be using the filter method, which is an array method in JavaScript. And this method returns an array. So there's no reason to do something like this because the method itself is returning an array. So what we want to do is on the array, which is the state value, we're going to be using the built-in JavaScript filter method. What it's going to do is get access to each item and look through each item, which we'll refer to as toast. And what it's going to do is check to see if the toast ID doesn't equal the ID that we passed into the function. Now you might be thinking, wait, the toast ID doesn't equal? Well, the way the filter method works is that it keeps the item in the state if it matches. So if the toast ID doesn't equal, that means we want to keep it in, meaning that we will keep it in the state and only the time it actually equals is when it's removed. All right, so now that we have that, that's everything for our state. And now what we can do is import these functions as well as this state throughout our entire application, subscribe to changes, as well as call these functions to update the state values. The next thing we need to do is go ahead and start creating some of our components. And the first components we're going to be creating are our icon components. Now let's go ahead and come into this lib folder, create a new folder, and call this one components. Inside of this components folder, I'll create a new folder and call it icon. You could just use the SVGs that I supplied in the code files, but what I actually like to do is go ahead and create actual components for the icons that I'm using. Of course, this could get difficult if you're using a ton of icons, but in this case, we just have a few. And for me, I like doing this because I can go in, copy and paste the SVG, and then I can go in and change the hex values to current color and then just use that component and then pass in a class if I wanted to actually style the SVG any way that I want. To me, this is just an easier way, and it's a lot cleaner than just, supplying them and pasting them inline inside your HTML. So with that said, let's go ahead and just create our first component here, which is going to be the cancel.svelte. Now what we do is we want to get the SVG code, and where we get that code is right from Figma. So we come into the Figma file, scroll down here and come to icons, come over to this cancel. I'm going to right click, say copy as, and then copy as SVG. Come back to our code and then paste it in. Let's go ahead and save that. All right, and most of this is fine. The only thing that I really need to change is this stroke value. You'll see that it's using this hex code. And again, what I want to do is change this to current color. What this is allow us to do is to use CSS, which we'll pass into the component, and then whatever text color that we pass in, if we want to use red or branding or whatever, it's going to use that color and apply it to wherever we use this current color, therefore changing the color of the SVG. You'll get a good idea of how this works later in the video once we actually do conditional styling based off of the type of toast that we pass into our state. But for now, let's go ahead and save that. And I'm just going to do essentially the same thing for the rest of the components. So I'll do one more just to show you so you have a good idea, and then jump forward in the video where we have the rest of them completed. So as you can see, I created a new component called check.svelte. Come into the Figma file, select the frame for this, copy as SVG. Then come back in, paste it, and anywhere there is a hex code, I will change this to current color. And again, I'm going to do this for the rest of the 4 icons and then come back to the video once I have that completed. All right, so I went ahead and created all the icons. We can see now right here in this icon folder. There's one more thing we need to do, and that is to pass in a class style so we can actually style these through the actual components. And it's kind of weird how you do this. You might think you could just pass in class and pass in whatever CSS that you want, but the issue is that the class prop is a reserved name, so you can't just refer to it. So there's kind of a weird workaround, which I found a solution to in the actual Svelte Docs. So you can see here what we do is we define a value called class name and then export it as class. So this allows us to use class to pass in the classes that we want. And then we use this class name inside of our component to pass in those classes to the component. Sounds a lot more complicated than it really is, but let's go ahead and talk about just how simple it is. So the first thing we need to do is do this, define these values inside of a script tag. And that's going to be let class name. Then we export the class name as class. And then we take this class name right here and pass it into our SVG. Now, recall the reason we're doing this is because we changed this to current color, we can then pass in like text color style here in Tailwind CSS to change the color of this SVG to whatever we want. Again, it sounds complicated, but you'll see this in use later in the video. Now what I need to do is go ahead and apply this same thing to the rest of the icons. So I'm going to skip forward to the video where I completed that for the rest of the icons. All right, so you can see here that I went through all of the icons and added this script where I defined the class name, passing it in here, and then exporting it as class. Therefore, we can pass this in as a prop to style the individual icons. I'm just going to go ahead and close all of our open editors here. And the next thing we want to do is actually start working on our toast components. So inside this components folder, I'll create a new folder, and this is going to be called toast. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here called toast.svelte. Then inside of a script tag, I'm going to import some of the things that we need here, including the state as well as some icons. The first thing I'm going to do is import the toast state as well as the remove toast function. And that's coming from our actual store that we created. The next thing we need to do is import the cancel icon, which we have autocomplete here. So I'm just going to hit tab to import that. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and write our HTML. And the first thing we need to do is create an if block. So the way to do the if block is a curly bracket, $if, and then we only want to render this if there is toast in the actual state. Now you could subscribe to the toast and then use a cleanup function to remove that subscription, which is tedious and typically what you would do in React, but Svelte makes this way easier with the syntax with using a $sign and then the name of the state value. This is going to create a subscription for us and handle all of the cleanup out of the box so we don't have to worry about it. And anytime this changes, our DOM is going to react. So let's go ahead and create our closing if statement. And then inside of here, we will go ahead and start writing our HTML. The first thing I want to do is create a div tag. And it's worth mentioning that I'm just going to write the HTML now and then come back later at the end of this section and then actually apply Tailwind to style it. So we can actually see the changes being applied in real time. So now that we have this container, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and loop through all the toast values and render them to the DOM. And we can do that with the each block. And what we want to do is, again, get access to the toast. And we can say render these as a toast. But what we can actually do here is destructure the values that we need. We need the ID, title, the message, as well as the type. Now, you could stop here, but what we're going to be doing later in the video is using some built-in animation functions from Svelte. And some of those refer or need a key value. And this key value helps Svelte keep track of the state. And the way we reference a key value is doing parentheses and passing in whatever the unique value is for this actual component or this element. In this case, it's going to be the ID. Now, if you recall, this ID is being generated by the unique ID package that we installed in our Svelte store. So we can rest assured that this ID is, in fact, unique. All right, so once we define that, let's go ahead and create our closing each block. And then we can go ahead and say this is a container with a role of alert. Then we'll have another container, and then again, another container. And I'm just going to add a note here. So if you do Command/, I can create a quick note saying this is where the ToastIcon component will be. So we'll get to that later. And then I'm going to create a container which is going to hold the text for our message and title. So I'm going to create a paragraph tag, passing in the title, which we get access to from the each statement above. And we're also going to be creating the message. All right, so outside of this div tag, I'm going to create a button. And we're going to be using the onClick handler. And what this onClick is going to do is it's going to call the remove toast function. So remove toast. And remember, we have to pass in the ID so it knows what toast it needs to remove. And again, we get access to that from the each function where we destructured it above. So inside of this button, I'm going to be putting the cancel component. So let's go ahead and say cancel. So right now we also want to make this accessible. And the way you can make this accessible because this is just an icon, it's not telling someone who might be using a screen reader what this is, what this button's used for. So what we can do is create a span tag where we define this button. So we'll say remove notification with a closing span tag. Whoops. Now, right now, this is going to be visible in the DOM, but we can use a class called SR only, which is going to hide it from the DOM, but still make it visible for screen readers, therefore making it accessible. The last thing I'm going to do is create one note outside of this div tag. So again, Command / and say ToastProgress. This is where our ToastProgress component, which we'll create later, is going to be. So now that we have our toast created, we can actually use it in our application. And you might be curious, where exactly should we put the toast component? And in this case, we want it to be viewable throughout our entire application. So as we referred earlier for our CSS, because we want it accessed throughout our application, a good place to put that is in our root layout component. So we come over here, let's go ahead and close this, come into routes and then layout. This would be a good place to reference our toast. So let's go ahead and import our toast from the component file. And then below here, above the slot, we can just say toast. Now let's go ahead and boot up our server. All right, so now that we have that, we're not going to see anything because our state is empty. So let's come into our state here into this lib folder, store, and then state. And instead of this being empty, let's go ahead and create our initial state. So we'll say ID1, title is hello. This is so awesome. And for the type, technically this isn't doing anything right now, but we'll go ahead and just set type to default. So if we come into our project, we're getting an error. We're getting an error because I didn't reference this as a message. So now if we come back, you'll see that we now have this state showing up. Again, it's not styled, and we're going to add some cool animations and make this look really nice. But now we can ensure that our toast is for sure rendering to the DOM. So now what I'm going to do is add the Tailwind CSS styles to this toast component, and then anytime we save it, we'll see it updated here on the right side in our browser. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and target this div. Now it's worth mentioning that this div is going to be holding all of our toast components, and we want to go ahead and position this where all of our components will be. So the first thing we're going to do is pass in class, setting this to absolute. If you save that, you can already see that it's changing. Therefore, it doesn't push the DOM elements down. It's just kind of floating right now. So the next we want to do is set top right to 4, right to 1/2, and then we want to set a Z index. Now the Z index, if you're not aware, is going to make sure that it's sitting on top of items. So currently a Z index of 30 is fine for our application, but if you're adding other items later down the road and need them to be above things, you might need to increase this Z index to ensure that the toasts are always above the rest of the elements in the DOM. Now it's also worth noting, if you've never written Tailwind CSS before, is that it is a mobile first approach. So the styles are, when you add them, they're applied to all the small screens upwards. And the way you override those are with breakpoints, targeting, sizes for small, medium, large, extra large, so on and so forth. So right now we're adding the styles for the smaller screens. And then as you'll see, we're going to be adding styles for the larger screens, which is going to change the overall styling of this component. The next thing we want to do is set it to flex, which is going to be used to align all of the toast components. And then we're going to set it to width full, but also set a max width to extra small. That way it takes up all the space it needs without getting any bigger than the extra small max width, which if we hover over this, you'll see that it's 20 rem or 320 pixels. So if we come into our styles here, into the home page, you'll see that on mobile, we're having these toast notifications centered. And then on bigger screens, they're over here hovering the right side of the page. So these styles, again, are what we're going to be using to style the smallest screens. So right now, the toast is going to be centered. And the way that we actually center items using absolute positioning is to use this, this is where this comes in. So we use right 1/2, so it moves it to the right half of the width of the page. But you can see that it's a little off, and what we need to do is to offset that. And the way we can offset that is with the translate property, where we transform it on the x-axis. The way we do that in Tailwind is say translate x 1/2. And that's going to move it half the length of the actual the DOM width. So if we save that, you'll see now that it's actually centered on the page. The next thing we want to do is change the flex direction. Now, right now it's going to be, flex left to right axis, but we want these to be stacked on top of each other. The way we do that is to say flex column. But what we want to do is actually have new ones at the bottom. So anytime new ones come in, it kind of pushes the rest up. And what we want to do to achieve that is set it to column reverse. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and space some of these items out using the gap property, which sets a column and row gap to, I believe it is, if we hover over 1 rem. Yeah, so 16 pixels by default. All right, so this is on the smallest screens possible. But again, we want on larger screens to override these values. Now you might think, okay, well, we want it on larger screens, so let's target the large styles. But instead, we want to actually apply these starting off on these small screens. So only on the very tiny mobile screens will we have the actual toast notification centered. Here is where we're going to start overriding some of the values. The first thing is I want to add a little bit more spacing for the top. Then I want to add the right, change this to 8. And I'm going to change the translate X, setting it to 0. And now you'll see, if we come over and inspect this, you'll see our div is now in the correct position. All right, so let's scroll down and come into this first div here, where we have the, which will be the container for each individual item. We want to set the position to relative because we're going to be using absolute position on the cancel button, and it needs to be and that cancel button needs to know what it needs to be relative to when it's absolute positioning itself. Otherwise, it's just going to find the nearest relative parent to actually reference itself to. In this case, we need to be very explicit and say, this is what you should be referencing. Next, I want to set overflow to hidden. And the reason I'm doing this is that we're going to have a progress bar that extends beyond the curved borders of this container. And we don't want that to be visible. Instead, we want it to be hidden. So it gives it, that nice consistent round borders throughout our toast notification. Speaking of round borders, let's go ahead and set the border radius to medium. If we hover over this, you'll see that it sets border radius to 0.375 rem, which is 6 pixels. Again, it's worth noting, where am I getting these values from? It's right from the Svelte file. So if I come in and look at this component for the toast, you'll see that it's applying a 6 pixel radius. Next thing I want to do is set background to white and set a shadow to large. And if we set that, you can already start to see it take some shape. The next thing I want to do is come into this div, and this container is just going to have a padding of 6. And that's just going to give it some padding from the edges of the container. Then on here, I'm going to set class to flex, and then items, which is going to say align items to center. That way they're all aligned, center each other in the container that they're in. Then we'll come into this part, which is going to be the part that's holding our messages. It will say margin left of 3, a border left, and we'll set the border color to a neutral 200. And we'll also give it some padding of left 3. Now, right now, you can see this added this border, and it's adding a margin left, but remember, we don't have our toast icon right now. But once we have the toast icon added, it'll be nice and centered like it is here. So essentially, this is what we're achieving. So if we zoom in, but right now we don't have the icon because we still need to set that up. Now let's go ahead and style the title. It's going to be text small, font semi-bold, and it's going to be the color of text neutral 900. Then I'm just going to copy this style. And what we want to do here, instead of semi-bold, we want this to be normal, and we want the color to be 700. And we could, because we're using text extra small here, and it's font size is inherited value, we could move this up here, and it will be inherited because that is the default for fonts. So let's just go ahead and move that because it's a little more cleaner. If we save that, you'll see that our styles are still the same. All right, so now the last thing we need to style is the button, which is probably going to be the most involved component or element here on this toast component. And the reason is because buttons have a lot of different things that you need to consider. They have a hover state, they have a focus visible state. So if someone's using a keyboard, you have to apply styles to make sure that that's accessible. So this one's going to be a little bit more complex, but Tailwind CSS makes it really simple to add the styles. First, we need to define the class. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this is going to use absolute positioning. So once we add that, you can see that it shrinks because it's no longer, affecting the rest of the content. And the next thing we need to do is tell it where it needs to go relative to the toast container. That's going to be a top of 2 and a right of 2. So if we save that, you can see that it's now being moved. So you can also see the remove notifications being, it's still here. And let's go ahead and just remove that because it's kind of affecting the styling right now. And as I mentioned earlier, the reason we have this is so this button is accessible, because right now there's no text inside of this button. It's just an icon. So if someone's using something like a screen reader, this is just going to ensure that this is still accessible, but it's going to hide it from those who don't need a screen reader. And Tailwind CSS has a handy class called SR only. So if we save that, you'll see now that that's being removed from the DOM, but it's still visible on screen readers. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's come back into our button and start continuing adding styles here. First, we'll say rounded full, which is going to make that a full circle, and we'll set that to background white. So nothing's really changed here, but we will see that circle once we actually hover over it. So let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the styles. And the first one is to add a little bit of padding, which is just going to add 4 pixels around this, giving it a little bit more space. Now let's go ahead and add a hover style. And the way we do that is saying hover colon, and we want to change this to a neutral 100. Whoops. So now if we hover over this button, you'll see the colors are being changed. And it looks like we're not seeing that, the roundness, because I misspelled that. So if we come back, you can see that circle being applied. Now let's go ahead and add some styles for when someone's using a keyboard. So we'll say focus visible. This is also going to be background neutral 100. We want to, again, add another focus visible style. This time we're going to set outline. We'll set the outline to a width of 2, and we want to offset the outline just a bit from the outside of the circle. So it kind of gives it this like ring effect. And the way we do that is, again, targeting focus visible, outline offset, and set that to 2. And the next thing we want to do is change the color of this. And I'm just going to set this to outline neutral 900. So now when you're using a keyboard, you'll see that we now have this nice dark outline surrounding the button, therefore making it easier for those who are using a keyboard and need that accessibility. It's very apparent where this button is in the DOM. All right, so if you remember, on these actual icon components, we created a workaround to pass in a class so we can style this however we want. So just as a refresher, let's just open this. And remember, we created this value called class name, renaming it to class, and then passing in that class name here, setting it to the style class. So now what we can do is inside here, we can pass in class and change the color of this icon based off of whatever text color we want. So to just make this obvious, let's do text red and set it to 500. And because we're using current color on this value here, on this stroke value, which was before a hex code, it's taking that text value and applying it to the SVG. But of course, we don't want this red for this style. Instead, we want to set it to a neutral 900. And there we go. That's basically all the styles for our toast notification, but we still need to add some our progress bar as well as our icons. But those are going to be using conditional styling, which we'll talk about in the next part of this tutorial. Now let's start working on our ToastIcon component. So inside of this toast folder, inside of our components folder, let's create a new file called toasticon.svelte. Inside of a script tag, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and import all of the icons that we want to support for this component. And the first one is going to be the check component. Then I'm just going to copy the code here and then paste it below to import the rest of the components that we need for this ToastIcon component. Now what I'm going to do is export or define a prop, which is again, a prop is a value passed into the component itself. And this is going to be used to dynamically render different things like the icon, as well as the CSS class that we need to style this component, depending on what it is. So if it's, default, brand, error, warning, or success. So I'm going to just call this value toast type, and we'll set it to a default value of default. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set an array of objects, which I'm going to use to, actually dynamically render, the components as well as the styles. And I'm going to call that value toast types. And that's again going to be an array. And inside of this, we're going to have objects. So the first one is going to have a format, which is default. Then we say component, passing in the component what needs to be referenced for the default format. In this case, it's going to be Telegram. Then on this, we want to define a style for the default format, which is text neutral 500. Now let's go ahead and move on to our next format object. So I'm just going to copy this one, paste it in and save it. And this time, instead of default, this is going to be for our brand. And the default for the brand is going to be the piece icon, and the style is going to be brand. All right, so now that we have an idea of how this works, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste the rest of the styles here and go over them really quickly. So for success, we're going to render the check component. Style is going to be the green. Warning is the warning component, style is yellow, and error is the fire component, and the style is red. Now we need to store the reference of the component as well as the style. And we can do that using the find array method. So we'll say let icon component equal toast types. And it's toast types find. So this is a built-in JavaScript array method. And what it's going to do is look at each type and see if the type format equals the toast type that we passed in. So remember, this is going to be a component that we pass in. So once we loop over these using an each block, we'll pass in a value. It's going to see if it's equal. If it's equal, and if it is, what it's going to do is get the component off of it. And essentially, we're going to do the same thing for the style. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it below. Obviously, we need to change this to icon style. And instead of getting access to the component value, this is going to get access to the style, which is a string value. We can then use this to dynamically add styles to our component. Now, you might be wondering, okay, we have reference to the icon, so how do we actually render it? And you might think, oh, maybe just do something like icon component or something like that. Well, Svelte makes this really easy using this special element called Svelte Component. This takes in a prop called this, which takes in the component that you want to render, in this case, the icon component. And then you can pass in all the standard props that you would typically pass in for this component. So in this case, we're going to be passing in a class. The first value is going to be that dynamic icon style. And then we'll just go ahead and set a height of 6 and a width of 6. And if we hover over this, you'll see that that is 24 pixels. And then we need to go ahead and close off this Svelte component. And that's everything for the toast icon. Now we need to actually use this in our toast component. So the first thing we'll do is we'll come in and import the toast icon. And then below here, where we had a note of where we're going to put it, which is right here, we'll go ahead and say toast icon. Remember, we need to pass in a prop here. If we come back, remember the name of that prop is toast type. So toast type equals, if remember, we get access to the type because we destructured it from the state value. So we'll say toast type equals type. All right, so let's go and look at our store really quick. You'll see here that the type is default. So if we look at the icon, what should render? It should be the telegram, and the color should be this neutral 500. So let's come back into our code here. And you can see here at the top, that's in fact what is happening. Now let's make sure that all the other values are working, or at least a couple of them. So we'll come into this here and change this to error. And in fact, we can see the red fire icon showing up. All right, so now let's start working on our Toast progress bar. So to do that, we'll create a component here in our Toast folder. We'll name this ToastProgress.Svelte. Now we're going to be doing something essentially very similar to what we did for the Toast icon, where we're conditionally rendering the classes. So we need to do that inside of our script tag. And the first thing we need to do is go ahead and export a toast type, which again is going to be a prop that we passed in. And we'll set the default for this, in case there's none passed in, to default. And like we did for the icons, I'm going to create a value called toast types, which is going to be an array of objects. Now the first object, again, we're going to say format. So this is going to be used to find a matching value. If this value matches, we're going to have a different styles that needs to be applied. The first one we're going to call background style, and this is going to be background neutral 200. And we also want to apply another style, and this one's going to be bar style. And this is going to be background neutral 500. All right, so now that we have an idea of what that looks like, I'm just going to paste in the other values for the other types that we could have. and just go over these really quickly. So the format for brand is going to apply a background style of brand 200, with 500 being the bar style. And you can see the same being applied for success, which is going to use green, warning is going to use yellow, and error is going to use red. Again, we're going to use the find array method to actually match these values and get access to them. So we'll say let background style equal toast types, the find array method. And then on each type value, we're going to see if the type format equals the toast type that we passed in. And if it does, go ahead and get access to the background style property. I'm going to copy this and paste it below. And essentially we're going to do the same thing, but this one's going to be for the bar style. So we'll call this bar style and get access to the bar style property. All right, so now we can go ahead and create our progress bar, which is actually very simple. The first thing is just going to be a container. And inside here is another container. On this one, we're going to go ahead and just set a height value of height 1, which is 4 pixels, and then pass in, it's actually in the beginning, pass in that value for the background style. The last thing we want to do is set a class here, passing in the bar style. So this is the color of the progress bar. We also want to set a height of 1, and we need to make sure we wrap this in quotes. And then we can go ahead and save this. Now, eventually we're going to animate this using CSS animations, but for now, let's go ahead and see what this looks like in our project. So we'll come back to our Toast component, scroll down to where we had our note here. We'll say ToastProgress, we'll import that. And remember, the name of the prop that we passed in is toast type. That's going to be equal to the type that we get when we destructured this in our each object, or in our each code block here. So we're passing in this value right here. So if we save that and go into our code, we now see, because this is an error, we get the red value. But as you can see, it's already fully, it's complete. There's no animations here. So how do we achieve that? Well, what we can do is define a custom animation inside of our Tailwind CSS. So as you might have guessed, we'll come into our Tailwind config, and let's go ahead and scroll down to after where we define these color values. Then let's go down to where we outside of where we define the color values, which is this closing curly bracket here. And then we'll say keyframes. Now the keyframes is the, how the actual animation is going to work. Now the first thing we need to do is name this animation, which we'll call progress. And we'll say at position 0, so 0%, the very start of the animation, we want to set a width equal to 0. Then what we want to do at the end of the animation, so once the animation reaches 100%, we'll set a width to 100%. So now that we define the keyframes, we now need to define the animation value. So that's going to be on animation. The name of this is progress. This is how we're going to reference it in our Tailwind CSS, which you'll see in just a second. And then we need to find our animation property values. And the first one is our animation name, which is progress, because we defined it right here. Then we'll go ahead and define the animation duration, which is 5 seconds. And we're making this 5 seconds because remember on the toast, when we add it, we set a set timeout to remove the toast after 5 seconds. So we want those values to be the same. We want it to be linear, which is going to be our animation timing function. So that way it consistently changes over time. The last thing we want to do is set our animation fill mode. In this case, the fill mode is forwards. Now this is kind of confusing name, but essentially what this means, or what this is doing, is once it reaches the end of the animation, we're telling this animation to just keep the styles as is. Don't restart any of the styles. So in this case, once it reaches the end of the animation, keep the width at 100%. All right, so now that we define those styles, let's come back into our progress bar. Scroll down to this bar style, and then we'll say animate progress. And now we should be able to see this being animated. So now that we have our toast styles styled correctly depending on the toast type, so let's go ahead and add a button that will trigger some of these to add the toast notifications depending on what we pass in. And then we can also go ahead and add some animations after we do that. So I'm going to head into our, close this, head into our routes, and then to our page, which is our home page, and just get rid of this. Now the first thing I'm going to do is create a script tag. And inside the script tag, I want to import the add toast, which is coming from our store. Then I'm just going to go ahead and create a container just to keep this nice and organized. So this part isn't very important. I'm just doing this to style it. And inside this divider is where we're going to put, or this container is where we're going to put the buttons. So I'm going to create a button here, give it a type of button, and give it a onClick handler. And this onClick handler is going to call the add toast function. Remember, we first pass in a title, which will say welcome. Then we'll pass in a message. So I'm just going to copy this from the project here. And then we need to go ahead and pass in a value. So for the type, which is the default. Inside here, we'll say trigger default. And I'm just going to add some stylings to this as well. And just to save time, I'm just going to copy these because like I said, this isn't really important for the project, but just to demonstrate the functionality. All right, so now we should be able to go back into our home page, and let's actually come back into our store and remove this default. All right, so now let's go back into our code, click on this button. All right, so you can see that appears. Progress bar is animating, styles look correct, and then it disappears. All right, so that's pretty cool. Let's go ahead now, and I'm just going to copy and paste these for the rest of the different button triggers. So if I paste those in, come back, let's trigger the brand, success, warning, and error. So this looks pretty good, but it'd be nice if there was some animations involved with this, just make things look a little nicer. You might be thinking, God, that sounds like it's going to be really complicated. But with Svelte, it's actually really, really simple to get some nice animations because it's built into Svelte out of the box. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back into our code, and I'm going to come into our components and then into our toast component. Then at the top, I'm going to import a couple things from Svelte. The first one is called fade. And that's coming from Svelte transition. Then I'm going to come into the container for each component. So this one that says roll alert, and then I can say n::fade. And that's all we have to do to add a nice subtle fade animation. Now there's some other values we could pass in here to control the duration and things like that, but the default value in this case is just fine. So now if we come into this and add it, you'll see that it has this nice fade animation. Now, you'll see once we delete one of these triggers, it kind of just fills the space automatically. Wouldn't it be nice if once we remove these, it kind of just slid up to fill the space and it kind of just took care of where it needed to go? Well, SvelteKit has a really simple solution for that as well. And it's called flip. Now, you might be thinking the flip is like flipping a card, but it actually stands for something else. It stands for first, last, invert, play. So essentially what this is going to do is give us the effect that if once we, let's say, remove something from the state, it's going to handle moving the next card up, and it kind of just gives us this nice organic fill. So let's go ahead and say import flip. That's coming from the Svelte animation. All right, so we'll come back to where we define the fade in, and this time we'll say animate, setting it to flip. In this case, we're actually going to change some of the default values. So on those, we'll say duration is 300, so 300 milliseconds. So now if we come back into our project, we're getting an error, which probably is just a typo. And it's not animation, but instead animate. Okay. So if we come back to this and refresh, So you'll see they'll fade in as normal. And see how that's sliding in, how it's adding it a little smoother. And if we remove this, how the ones just kind of slide up to fill the space. And there's literally all we had to do in order to get this nice functionality was to import this flip animation and then apply it here on this container. And there we go. And now we have this really nice toast notification system for our SvelteKit application. And it was really simple to do. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And be sure to check out all of our code challenges on skillthrive.com, as well as all of our content here on YouTube. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.